Ellora in western India consists of Buddhist, Hindu and Jain caves built over several hundred years from the 6th to the 13th century. Among the Buddhist caves, there are many chaityas or prayer halls. There are also viharas or monasteries where at one time hundreds of monks must have stayed, learnt and prayed. The Jain caves are more austere than the others, but one of them, dedicated to Mahavir, has fine carvings. The Kailash temple is the most famous building in this complex. Carved painstakingly top down from a single rock face, it's among the largest monolithic structures in the world. The caves at Ellora are a reminder of a period centuries ago when craftsmen with simple tools carved out fabulous structures representing some of the best in Indian art, its pluralistic culture and its desire for spiritual truth. The world-famous rock-cut caves at Ajanta too give a vivid picture of that continuing search. Yet, such is the sense of history of India's civilization that the caves were forgotten for centuries. It was the chance sighting of one of the arches across the gorge by a British hunter that led to the rediscovery of the caves and the wonderful sculptures and paintings inside them. Sadly, the rediscovery of the caves also led to the caves being vandalized by thoughtless visitors who sought to immortalize themselves by carving graffiti on priceless art. But in a way, the seeds of this modern-day barbarism can be traced back to the very period in which the caves of Ajanta and Ellora took shape. For this period of fantastic art was also the long feudal interlude in our history. It was Indian history's twilight zone. The twilight period lasted a long time in India, sandwiched between two glorious reigns, those of Ashoka the Great and Akbar the Great. Many kings came in between and tried to shape society, but their impact was limited. Among such rulers, there were many who came from outside to make India their home. They adopted Indian ways, they influenced India and India influenced them. The division of Indian society on the basis of caste had been a feature present from much earlier. It was during this twilight period, however, that this feature grew and acquired a definite shape. Even today we can see Adivasis adopting different ways of life and blending the modern with the traditional. This, in fact, has been the way that the tribals get co-opted into caste society, a process that began centuries ago. Sanskritization, or the claiming of a higher status in the caste hierarchy by a lower caste, was now put to use to increase political power. The coinage issued by various rulers during this period provides some evidence that upward mobility in the political arena also called for upward mobility in the social setup. This was particularly necessary for recent immigrants who came to rule over different parts of India. The post-Mauryan Indo-Greeks, Indo-Bactrians, Parthians, Scythians and Huns all tended to follow this pattern of adopting aspects of high Indian culture. This pillar at Besnagar is an example. It was erected by Heliodorus, the Greek ambassador from Takshila to Vidisha. Heliodorus proclaimed himself to be a devotee of Vasudeva, who is also known as Krishna, an incarnation of Vishnu. This building at Girnar contains a rock which gives us a good illustration of this process of adoption of elements of Indian high culture by recent immigrants. The great Mauryan Emperor Ashoka used the local language to spread his message even as far as Gujarat. This very rock was used much later, in the 2nd century AD, by Rudradaman, the Shak ruler, to engrave his own inscriptions.
Rudradaman takes pride in his military prowess, in the fact that he defeated Satkarni and he also entered into matrimonial alliance with him. But most of all, he takes pride in his knowledge of Sanskrit. Sanskrit was already becoming a classical language, and to that extent, Sanskritization of an early sort legitimized the rule of foreigners and others who wanted to become upper caste.
Among the immigrants were the Kushans, best known through Kanishk, whose headless statue stands today in the Mathura Museum. One of the most interesting things about this statue is that it is the earliest representation of a man wearing stitched clothes. This indicates the establishment of the craft of tailoring by then, with the tailors becoming one more caste group. While the Kshatriya castes increased their hold over political power, the Brahmins dominated culture through their control over rituals and rites of passage. The Brahmins not only demanded fees for performing priestly functions, but they also received substantial land grants.
When these land grants are made, they are mostly made to Brahmanas or temples managed by Brahmanas. So, in that sense, the landowners mostly belong to the upper orders. And there is a saying in early medieval times, Kshatriyo Raja Uchyate. Whoever happens to be a Raja is a Kshatriya, or whoever happens to be a Kshatriya is a Raja. That shows the ethos of the time.
The granting of land led to the extension of agriculture to newer areas, since by then the river basins were intensively cultivated. The new landowners in this way helped in the development of new centers of power. Gwalior was one such centre which emerged in that twilight period, and it retained its importance through successive regimes.
An interesting aspect of the rulers of Gwalior, as for that matter many rulers in these parts, is that they did not start with a high social position or a high ritual position. They achieved high ritual position. The various houses of Kshatriyas who claim to have ruled over Gwalior, for instance, were not originally Kshatriyas. The Hans were no Kshatriyas. The Kachwahas, the Parihars, the Tomars also became Kshatriya, and they did so by performing various sacrifices which the Brahmins ordered for them. An interesting sacrifice was where the king would enter into a golden pot and emerge out of it as a Kshatriya. The pot, of course, was kept as Dakshina by the Brahmin.
The colonization of new lands required agricultural innovation through the adoption of new crops. For instance, the clearing of the densely forested coastal tracts would not have been economical but for the humble coconut. Such agricultural innovations led to greater surpluses. The new society based on such surpluses was not only more peaceful and less extortionate than the unsettled post-Mauryan regimes, but also decidedly more cultured. However, even as there were some innovations in culture and agriculture, the characterizing feature of this period was a kind of stagnation typical of feudalism.
Indian feudalism had to be seen in terms of the presence of a dominant class of landowners and a servile and dominated class of peasantry. That is there, and from this peasantry surplus is extracted not for promoting economic growth, not for promoting market or any kind of thing, but it is extracted just for the consumption.
The consumption patterns are illustrated by the quality and quantity of coinage of various kingdoms that followed the Mauryas. The beautiful gold coins of the Guptas, for instance, have suggested to some historians the existence of a golden age. But the fact is that the relative scarcity of humbler coins suggests that trade was increasingly restricted to high-value luxury goods. Commodities of general usage were not as widely and as frequently traded. The so-called golden age of the Guptas is a lasting myth of Indian history. Undoubtedly, that period saw the flowering of literature and the arts and even of some science. The names of the poet Kalidas and the scientist Aryabhatta shine in the firmament of this period, in which even the Emperor Samudragupta is depicted as an accomplished musician. But it is inaccurate to portray the period, as many historians do, as a time when India discovered its glorious nationhood. Indeed, it was not the Guptas who created nationalism, but 20th century nationalism that effectively created the Guptas.
The Guptas certainly didn't have that kind of golden age if you go by archaeological excavations. All the towns in northern India that have been excavated in Gupta times, they belong to the 3rd century AD, 4th century AD. These towns are either deserted or they are in a state of utter decline.
By the time the Chinese traveller Fa Hien came to India during the rule of the Guptas, many cities which were prosperous during the Mauryan Empire were in ruins, almost as they are today. Rajgir, the first capital of the Magadhan Empire, was deserted. Today, all that can be seen of this historic site associated with the Buddha and with Mahavir are the remnants of the Cyclopean or encircling walls. Kushinagar, where the Buddha attained parinirvana, was similarly desolate. The stupa which marked the site of the cremation of his mortal remains was forgotten, and the monastery near the master's final resting place was in ruins. Kapilavastu was completely forgotten. The later Chinese traveller Huan Sang speaks of it being located in a completely different place from what archaeology has revealed to be the original site.
What is the exact solid argument or evidence that this is Kapilavastu and not Vipravaha? Or otherwise, what evidence the other party has that this is not the Kapilavastu and Vipravaha the Kapilavastu?
There is still some debate among scholars about this site in Nepal. Was it the city that Siddhartha Gautam left to seek enlightenment? Patna, which inherited the historical legacy of Patliputra, continues as a living city. Till the Gupta age, it still retained some of its former glory. Today, little is visible of the remains of Ashoka's palaces. But even in Huan Sang's time, although the structures had not been totally ruined, their grandeur was ascribed to supernatural powers and not to common mortals. A hospital built in the time of the Guptas was also to disappear into myth soon enough, in spite of the fact that an inscription refers to the physician Dhanvantari practicing there.
ये आरोग्य विहार है, धन्वंतरी वैद्य का चिकित्सालय। अब वो धन्वंतरी वैद्य हैं, जैसा कहा गया है और इतिहास गवाह है कि उनके नेत्र के ज्योति में इतनी शक्ति थी कि सर्प के काटे हुए स्थान को अगर अपने आंखों से देख लेते थे तो सर्प का विष समाप्त हो जाया करता था।
There are but few remaining freestanding buildings to recall the glories of the Gupta period. This temple, though, has survived at Sanchi, where Ashoka and the Sungas had earlier built other larger structures. During this period in history between Ashoka and Akbar, there were few permanent royal court buildings, as kings kept on the move. Cities became less important after the Guptas, as kings constantly travelled with army, harem, court and secretariat. Grants were dated from camp headquarters. An example is this little fort built by Sher Shah more than 1,000 years after the Guptas and still in use today. One later king who kept on the move, fighting incessantly for 30 years, was Harsh of Kannauj. Bana, a contemporary writer, describes the panic and devastation caused by the royal progress through the king's own territory. A plague of locusts could hardly have been more ruinous for the villagers.
शेरशाह सूली जो है दक्षिण भारत के लिए विजय करने के लिए निकला था। उस टाइम उन्होंने रेस्ट के लिए पड़ाव डालने के लिए फौज के लिए 2 दिन या 4 दिन उसके लिए फौज के लिए सराय बनवाई ठहरने के लिए।
Today, the fortress is being used somewhat differently. Despite the unsettled conditions in this long twilight period, elements of Indian culture and particularly of Buddhism spread far and wide. The notion of Greater India disguises one ugly aspect of Indian history, which also unfolded at the same time. Religious conflicts started taking shape. The fact that Bodhisattva statues are still worshipped in Bodh Gaya as those of the Pandavas is a continuing reminder of such religious conflict, which has existed in India since then. The case of two contemporary rulers illustrates this trend well. Harsh represented the multi-religious tradition of India. He was simultaneously a sun worshipper, a follower of Maheshwara and the Buddha, devotee of Ahimsa and a warlord. The other ruler was Shashank Narendra Gupta of Bengal and the last of the northern Guptas. He invaded Harsh's kingdom, destroyed Buddhist foundations and cut down the tree under which the Buddha had attained enlightenment. The temple that was destroyed in the process was rebuilt centuries later. The remarkable feature of Shashank's invasion was its religious guise. Shashank was beaten back by Harsh, but Harsh himself lost a war with the Chalukyan Pulakeshin, who in turn was beaten by his southeastern neighbors, the Pallavas.
Between the time of Ashok and Akbar, who built this, there were many kings of India who had some degree of greatness, but none of them really qualified to be called the Great. Precisely in the middle of this period, there was a whole series of kings who existed at about the same time. There was Harsh of Kannauj, there was Shashank of Bengal, there was Pulakeshin the Chalukya, and then there were the Pallavas. Their power was more or less evenly matched, and they fought with each other and kept defeating each other. The result was that none of them really qualified to be called the Emperor of India.
During this period of political conflict at the social level, new parochial castes arose to replace both guild and tribe, and civilization regressed.
Before Manu, we have about 13 mixed castes, then we have 25 mixed castes. In Manu, we have 61 mixed castes. When we come to the Barham Vaivarta Puran in the 7th century AD, which enumerates 100 castes, mixed castes, and then says Sahasrasha, thousands and thousands of other castes who are not enumerated. So the number went on mounting because the various tribal communities, they had their own names, and when each one of this community was absorbed within the fold of the larger Brahminal community, each one was absorbed as a caste. So you have a large number of castes whose names are not of Sanskritic origin.
At Chittor in Rajasthan and elsewhere, Sati stones like these are still honoured, and the common stock of Sati legends has been constantly added to. This barbaric rite grew in fashion among the upper castes during the Middle Ages. Harsha's mother, Yashomati, died in this gruesome manner about 604 AD. At another level, the mark of the village was seen in the development of ordeals. There are many instances of even rulers cutting off various parts of their bodies to appease the gods. Society in this so-called golden age thus slipped back into the primitive and continued to do so for a few centuries more. But even as this was happening, the increase in surplus led to the construction of magnificent temples. Some of the finest examples are to be found in Orissa. One of the most important temples is that of Jagannath at Puri. It's been suggested that the deity at Puri has tribal characteristics, but that suggestion is hotly contested by others.
जगन्नाथ जी प्योर आर्यों की देवता है। जगन्नाथ जी कोई अनार्यों की, कोई शैवों की, शाक्तों की, नहीं तो सबरवासियों की नहीं। ये जगन्नाथ जी जो शब्द है, जगन्नाथ, बलदेव, सुभद्रा और सुदर्शन, ये चारों संस्कृत शब्द है, आदिवासी शब्द नहीं है। ये बिल्कुल जगन्नाथ जी को जो पूजा पाठ होता है, बिल्कुल आर्य पद्धति से होता है।
Another fine example of Orissan temple architecture is the Lingaraj temple at Bhubaneswar. The Orissa school of temple architecture flourished from the 8th to the 13th centuries, precisely the period both of the flowering of feudalism and of the overall decline in trade and commerce. The grandeur of the Jagannath Puri temple and that of Bhubaneswar paled in comparison with the ritually dead temple of the sun god at Konark. This was at one time one of the largest and most splendid temples of India. The temple is conceived as a chariot drawn by the prancing horses in which the sun god rides across the heavens. What Konark is best known for is the exceptionally frank eroticism of many of its sculptures.
I think Mituna is a very good and fine object of artistical presentation, and I think it's a better object than battle or war, which is in our culture unfortunately sometimes too often represented.
There have been many theories to explain the sculptures. Some conjecture that they were to represent the world of weak flesh in contrast with the true strength of spirituality represented by the temple's bare interior. Others hint at the temple being the center of a growing tantric cult. Or maybe the sculptures just serve the mundane purpose of advertising the charms of the Devadasis. In any event, the Middle Ages saw a marked decline in the position of women in India. However, history is often enough written as success stories rather than as tales of dismal failure. What is emphasized about the Middle Ages are chivalry, charity, the miraculous, and the magical. Such notions of history have deeply penetrated our consciousness. And if this period is remembered today as the age of chivalry, we mustn't forget that it was also the age of decline, of India's long twilight.